What I'm really concerned about right now is the school experiences, the life experiences of Black girls.
We need to address the fact that the new face of intersectional erasure may be girls of color. It may be that the ways in which they're experiencing the workforce, the ways in which they're pushed out of school, the ways in which they're seen as being little women as opposed to girls, is the new face of intersectional erasure.
As most of the nation knows, so much attention has been given to Black boys and men over the past 20 years or so in education research. So it is refreshing that we are now seeing a rightful inclusion of Black girls and women, because they really are pushed out of schools in some uniquely gendered ways that haven't been fully considered.
I think Black girls are seen as either invisible or they're problematized, meaning there's fault with them. They're looked at through a deficit lens, if you will. I think that many of the attributes that sustain them are not celebrated. They're too loud, they're too bossy, they're just too much.
African American women played significant roles at all levels of the civil rights movement, yet too often they remain invisible to the larger public.
Fancy magazine, gave the credit for Black Lives Matter to a guy.
Oh, of course.
Give him the credit due him.
That's right.
But didn't mention the women at all who started this whole movement. It's like a lot of people began to say it's happening already, that the women are being erased.
Black girls are misunderstood, misread. A lot of their identities teachers do not understand, or oftentimes, they are victims. And so I think if we're going to talk about, the issues that are impacting our most vulnerable, it's Black girls. And that hasn't been said.
Yes, say it, Bettina. And everyone you've heard so far sharing their views on Black girls and women. You just heard and saw Bettina Love, Sean Harper, and Terry Watson speaking as part of a YouTube Education Week commentary series on Black girls, discipline, and schools by Education Week. You also heard Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw from a conference I attended a few years back. I was so excited. I recorded some of her speech to keep with me. And you also heard Dr. Janet Bell, who appeared on Black America with host Carol Jenkins for the episode called The Erasure of Black Women from History. As you've noticed, this is by far not your usual episode of Daily Border Crossings. There's visuals instead of just audio. There's a theme instead of an interview with one or two people. This episode is being devoted to a project for a Harvard Graduate School of Education class called Say Her Name, Race, Gender, and Violence, from Tituba to Breonna Taylor. The class focused on Black women, and the leaders said we could do something as our final thing to turn in. Something besides a traditional paper. Now, I like a challenge, even if it does keep me on the road less traveled, or have me up at, say, 3 a.m., still working on the project. Part of that, though, is combo effects of a perfectionist and procrastinator personality. But let me not get caught up too much in personal commentary. So what is this? That's a good question. Think of this as what you might get if a research paper came to life. So what is a PodPaign? That's also a good question, especially since you wouldn't know since I just made it up for this project. Now, let me pause for some self-care praise. PodPaign? Girl, look at you over there coining terms like Kimberly Crenshaw. Okay, I see you. Okay, so the PodPaign is essentially a podcast and campaign for #ustoo, which I'll tell you about shortly. For the project, I will be exploring the juxtaposition of Black women being centered versus Black women being pushed to the margins and erased. I'll be exploring these two questions. How does centering the ways in which Black women live and love, survive, and struggle for freedom point toward the liberation of all people? And how and why is it that Black women, a group of people so seemingly pivotal, so crucial to the well-being of so many other groups in this country, of people whose skin is shades of brown, so it's impossible to not see, why and how is it that they have historically been and continue to be invisible to society? Think of it this way. Black women show up excited, ready to be centered, centering themselves at times, but often end up like this: dismissed, disregarded, distorted, repeatedly. The campaign piece for #ustoo you see here and there, I created it a few years back when, in my opinion, aspects of the Me Too movement were being co-opted and not considering or being inclusive of Black women. In essence, erasing them. So the timing for it is perfect. #ustoo is a push for people to remember, respect, and regard Black women. As you can see in the last set of pictures, even the greats among us, people will try to diminish. Katherine Johnson sent a man to space and for about 80 years was erased. And by the way, have I mentioned how excited I am about this? Like, I love creating. I'm super excited. Okay, so now that we've set the stage, let's look at where we're going. We'll look at some of these notable yet mostly erased women, primarily those involved in civil rights, so we can see who they were and what they did, what kinds of traits they had. A good number of them are still alive. Throughout this episode, I'll be arguing in favor of centering Black women and arguing for #ustoo. So I'll be referencing readings from the class, as well as using some of those readings to guide conversations with my guests. What's the purpose of that? In referencing the readings, I'll be verbally citing my sources. Creative, right? I'm so excited. Speaking of excitement, I'm super excited about my guests. They are thought leaders. There's esteemed law professor Eko Yanka, who practices and teaches law with a moral perspective in mind. Academic technology coordinator and diversity, equity, and inclusion enthusiast Jonathan Fichter. The Reverend Jennifer Gamber of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, who's done extensive race work through a faith-based lens in and outside of the church. And Harvard med student LaShira Lash Nolan, whose medical work is at the intersection of race and underserved/marginalized communities. Lash is the first Black woman class president that Harvard Medical School has had. This sis is doing big things. It's no surprise. She has the best spirit. This is someone who's trying to be a doctor, who's super concerned about marginalized communities. Can you imagine being one of her patients? Honest, fun, sincere, caring, passionate, and brilliant. After those guests, 2 of whom are Black and 2 of whom are white, what are people who are not Black or white thinking about Black women? How do they feel? I gathered up some fellow grad students who are people of color, though not Black or not fully Black. Wait till you hear their powerful perspectives and thoughts on this matter. After exploring today's questions with my guests, I'll consider what's been learned from all the exploring and then begin the wrap up. So good day, good people. So glad you're with me on this exciting journey on Black women. So when I think of terms like these, leader, publisher, chief strategist, lecturer, Army information specialist, professor of law, board chairman, author, I think of men. I could do some self-reflecting to figure out why exactly that is, but immediately I think it's because of who society inherently centers and the sorts of roles and titles they have. Now, consider these roles as descriptors of Black people. Okay, Black women in particular. Dr. Janet Bell, author of Lighting the Fires of Freedom, African American Women in the Civil Rights Movement, talks to Black America host Carol Jenkins about a number of these women.
Myrlie Evers, I asked her how she coped when her husband was killed essentially in front of her and her children. And she told me that she played it out in her mind because she knew it was that the times were dangerous. What would happen if? It was not that she was fearless. She knew how to cope with fear. And Myrlie Evers, after she stayed in that house for a year and a half or so, and then realized that she needed to take her 3 children to California, where she went back to school and earned her own degree. She is a woman who absolutely knows how to work in partnership, knows how to stand on her own, and she is so supportive of the Black community. So she's, to me, she is my single biggest role model.
But continue to be active in the NAACP
and not totally appreciated. Her leadership was supported by her then husband or her second husband. The organization has evolved somewhat, but not entirely.
Yes.
So Myrlie Evans, in some ways, it's just, she's a little prickly sometimes, and I love that because she says, and some of the other women also intimated, we're not museum pieces, we are real people. And so that's how I think to know their full complexities is really even more important to know than to know their iconic status.
Right. Well, Kathleen Cleaver.
I love her.
I know, so do I. I met her for the first time recently, but certainly had covered her as a reporter when she was with the Black Panthers. Now she's a grandmother and is teaching, and she's a law professor. And as we sat there and talked about our grandchildren, I thought, what an arc of, how times have changed.
On the run from the FBI,
right,
on
gosh.
most wanted
Right.
list. But she came back, she graduated undergraduate summa cum laude.
Yes.
She clerked for
Brilliant.
Judge Leon Higginbotham.
Brilliant.
She's one of the smartest people ever. And she still has that fire in her. But Kathleen had besides her own wonderful brilliance and her own sense of self, she has a sense of adventure. She also she's really has self-knowledge in the sense that she knows how valuable she is to this world, and she's also dedicated to her grandchildren.
What about Diane Nash?
But Diane Nash was played in the movie Selma. And speaking of how the erasure of women from history, they had this pretty actress playing Diane Nash, who's still gorgeous and 70-something, right? And this young woman in the film is sitting on a desk, and she's listening to the guys planning the march and stuff like that. And I'm sitting...
That made me a little...
I was in the theater, and I'm trying to hold myself down and not scream. I thought, this woman is a strategist.
Right.
She was the leader of the Nashville student movement. Why have they diminished her so? And I've asked other people if they noticed her in the film, and they remember this pretty woman on the desk. But they didn't know the history of Diane Nash. Before the Freedom Ride, she had everybody make out wills because it was that dangerous. And so when the government, the United States government, tried to talk the students out of doing the Freedom Ride, she said, you don't understand, we made our wills out last week, we're ready.
Wow. Okay, now Gloria Richardson.
Gloria Richardson of the Cambridge movement in Maryland was considered, I think Jet magazine called her the Lady General of the Civil Rights Movement, because she was one of the first people who said, I'm not quite sure about this nonviolent thing. And that was quite controversial, not only within the movement, but outside of the movement. And there's this great picture of her with the National Guard having their rifles like that, and she's face to face. She was just astounded that anyone would point a gun at her, and she just refused to turn away.
Another movie.
Yeah, and she's still alive. She left Cambridge, Maryland. She came up to New York. She was working in the Social Workers Union, Local 371. She's a labor person.
Fascinating, right? Like, most of us might not have heard of a number of them, and they were so instrumental to the civil rights movement, where we hear a lot about the men. So there's Gay McDougall, who you see here, who helped organize anti-apartheid movement. She has had an integral role with human rights with the UN for over 30 years. First UN independent expert on minority issues, professor of law. We have Leah Chase. So she was a chef, and I've heard it talked about before how women do most of the cooking, yet most of the chefs are men. What's that about? So Leah Chase she passed away not too long ago, but she was a New Orleans icon. They called her the Queen of Creole Cuisine, and she owned Dookie Chase's restaurant. That was her husband. They owned it together. When he passed away, she kept going. She was still cooking in her 90s. She cooked there for 70 years. What she did with the movement was she defied segregation laws. She took the risk of allowing people to meet at their restaurant, to let that be the meeting place for activists and civil rights leaders, which was actually against the law at that time. So I'll read her quote. "I was just feeding people. They were fighting for something. They didn't know what they would find when they went out there. They didn't know what would happen to them on the streets. But when they were here, they knew I'd feed them. That's what I could do for them." Okay, so that's another legend. And you have Daisy Bates, who was head of the NAACP in Little Rock. I feel like most of the NAACP heads were men, but here's somebody. She was also a publisher. She owned a newspaper, a journalist, a lecturer. And then Elizabeth Eckford. This picture is so striking. If you see the woman right behind her, or all those people, can you just imagine? It's almost like, what, did you really not have anything better to do than just follow this woman? She actually said that later she had issues with public spaces with large crowds. How could she not? The woman right behind her looks quite evil, the face that she's making, and they're screaming at her. She was a teenager, one of the Little Rock Nine, and so she's just a young child here trying to go to school, but she became an activist, and she too became a journalist and an Army information specialist and a military reporter. So Elizabeth Eckford, who I did not know. Joanne Robinson. So much of the Montgomery boycott, we only hear about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, right? She, before both of them, she had this idea that there should be a boycott. She did not like how she was treated on the bus. She did not like where she had to sit. She even wrote a letter to the mayor threatening that they would do this, like over a year before it even happened. So she was a lead strategist, and she worked for the Alabama Women's Political Council. She was a part of the organization at first, and the leadership was not interested in hearing her points about a boycott. They didn't think any such thing was possible. But she ended up becoming the president, and she got right to work working on it. And so she helped. She was quite instrumental. In fact, Dr. King mentioned her in his book. He said regarding the boycott, apparently indefatigable, she, Joanne Robinson, perhaps more than any other person, was active on every level of protest. And a quote from her, "Women's leadership was no less important to the development of the Montgomery bus boycott than was the male and minister-dominated leadership." All right, and the last person I want to talk to you about is Pauli Murray. Myself and some colleagues, some fellow students were quite disappointed that we were never taught about her. Pauli Murray was way ahead of her time. She actually wrote the law paper. Thurgood Marshall called it his law Bible. She wrote it. It's like this 700-page thing that he used to argue Brown versus Board of Education. Did not tell her that he was using that, but he knew that that was how good it was. She went to Howard Law School. She was the only woman, dominated by men. She was not treated so well. They expected her to not last, but she not only did she last, she graduated ahead of the class. She beat all of them out with her grades and her study ethics. And she effectively overturned Plessy. When she had this idea, she's like, everybody's focusing on the separate but equal part of the equal. Let's make things equal. She's like, but what if things weren't separate? And they laughed at her. They were like, this is the way it is. It's always going to be this way. She dreamed bigger, and she bet that 25 years from that time, things would be different. And they took the bet, and guess what? In 10 years from when she made the bet, Brown versus Board of Education happened, which, as we know, ended segregation in schools. But she also was the first African-American woman ordained an Episcopal priest, the first to earn a JSD degree from Yale Law School, a founder of the National Organization for Women. She had a close relationship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was quite a pioneer, and she even orchestrated sit-ins, right, and refused to get off the bus and got arrested 2 decades before the Civil Rights Movement. So Pauli Murray is somebody to know. So these are the sorts of people that women whose names end up erased or dismissed. Why? I wondered why, with people as great as this, if these were men, I'm sure we would have heard about them. These are leaders, bona fide leaders. And so I wondered, why might that be?
The most disrespected person in America is the black woman. The most unprotected person in America is the black woman. The most neglected person in America is the black woman.
Ouch. Thanks for that reminder, Brother Malcolm. I feel that. So let's look at some readings from the class to think about why this might be. Could it be because if we think about Andrea Smith's sexual violence as a tool of genocide, she talks about slave rape, essentially. She says, and because Black women were seen as the property of their slave owners, their rape at the hands of these men did not count. As one Southern politician declared in the early 20th century, there's no such thing as a virtuous colored girl over the age of 14. These sorts of things stick in our psyche, and I wonder if this contributes to why we're so disrespected, neglected, erased. Another idea comes from Mariama Kaba's foreword in Andrea Ritchie's Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. She writes, the death of women in police custody by means of law enforcement's measures to discipline and punish is an issue rarely raised in feminist explorations of women and violence or masculinist explorations of racism and policing. By centering the experiences of girls and young women of color, Invisible No More extends and enlarges the carceral landscape, insisting that we consider the streets, the schools, and the home as sites of oppressive policing. Invisible No More argues that paying attention to these issues expands and transforms how we consider policing. So the police are supposed to protect us, right? But when they're harming us, does that consider making us look like people worthy to be harmed? Is it perhaps misogynoir? Dr. Moya Bailey created this portmanteau. A portmanteau is a word blending the sounds and combining the meanings of two others, like motel and brunch. You know what that means? Wait, that means PodPaign is a portmanteau. I created one too. Woo, woo. Listen, I'm doing big things over here, okay? Just saying. So Dr. Bailey defines misogynoir as the specific combination of anti-Black and misogynistic representation in visual culture and digital spaces that shapes broader ideas about Black women. So it's a combination of misogyny, sort of hatred of women, noir, French for Black. She gives some examples. When Black girls are expected to avoid predators, while white girls are expected to be protected from them, that's misogynoir. When a juror says in Surviving R. Kelly that he didn't like how Kelly's accusers were dressed during his 2008 trial and therefore didn't believe their testimony, that's misogynoir. I bet that adds to why they are erased. Lastly, this idea of us as props. In Patricia Hill Collins' On Intellectual Activism's chapter on Black feminist thought, she does a really interesting analogy on thinking about watching a play. There's a star, typically a young, blonde, attractive, virile, white American male, and all these people, all the stagehands and extras are props that are just there for the sole purpose of propping up the star. They get no lines, their lives aren't thought of, they're just collecting dust when they are not helping prop up the star. Regardless of their appearance or function, we only see or hear from those props via their roles in the star's story. So that's another reason to consider about why we are erased. Now, another exciting part where I get to do research, by the opportunity to dig deeper by interviewing my special guests. When I saw law professor Eko Yanka's moving piece on PBS NewsHour comparing the unjust treatment of the opioid crisis with that of the crack epidemic, I knew he was somebody I wanted to talk to. I had a feeling he would have compelling moral perspectives. I was right. He did not disappoint, and neither do the others. They kept blowing and opening my mind. I'm getting excited just thinking about it. Wait until you hear their perspectives and their compelling reasons for the need to center Black women. Hashtag us too. With Professor Eko Yanka, it specifically focuses on Black women, exploring the complexities of Black women and the nuances. This group that, in my opinion, shows up at the center or tries to, but gets pushed to the margins or erased. There were so many, I'm always learning some new name of a person who did this extraordinary thing in history that I never knew because you hear about Rosa Parks, you hear about Harriet Tubman, but there's so many that did other things. And so with that in mind, I want to ask your thoughts. Do you have thoughts on the roles of Black women or how they, how Black women get to show up or don't get to show up in not even just in history, I guess, like the erasure piece, like what do you see?
So I when you emailed me the question, I thought it was such a terrific question. And I wish I was more expert in the particular subject. So I won't pretend that I'm a historian. I will say, there is something, arrogance not quite the right word. There's something cruel and unjustified in the way that we constantly think of Black women as able to save the day when America needs her, but to be ignored otherwise, right? I mean, the most topical moment of this currently has been, every liberal, and frankly, even a wider swath of people, not just liberals, praising the role of Black women in the most recent election, right? That this core group of voters are the ones who have brought America back to sanity. But then when Black women made demands on an administration or during the election, right, there's a conversation, well, how much should the Democratic Party become radical? How much should they listen to, there's this sort of sense, well, no, of course we expect you to save us when the chips are down. But then when you demand the same things that every voting bloc demands, right?
Yes.
Somehow it seems as extraordinary or extreme. Nobody thinks it's extreme. Indeed, there's been a whole 4-year, I'll use the word elegy now, about how working class white men need to be served better by politics. And I think a lot of that is right. But why is it that when Black women say the same thing, it's, the question is this, how radical should the party get? As though somehow those demands are radical in a way that's different than working class white men. But sorry, that's just the most immediate and topical. What I really thought when I got your email is that you're absolutely right. And one of the things that people need to learn more or notice more is that whenever America has tended to the most vulnerable people, it has always been to the benefit of everybody, right? I mean, and this is clearly the case with Black women. So the fight that Black women had during both the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, the question about Black enfranchisement first, and then after that, the right of women to vote, the enfranchisement of women in the 19th Amendment, that had a constant thread of the question of how will Black women and when will Black women be allowed to vote? And the fractures that came to be when at first the question was all Negroes should vote, and that meant Negroes would be granted the vote along with women. And finally, a kind of political deal or betrayal that, well, if we ignore the women question, right, then Black men can get the vote, and we'll just set aside the question of suffrage for women for the moment. And of course, we see now, decades later, when Black women joined with women to vote, that our democracy not just became better, but so much more sane. I mean, so many of the things we count on as political advancements in the last century have in part been because women could vote. When you think of the way in which we tried to support the elderly and Social Security, right? Again, my point here is not just about Black women, though it is hugely impacted by Black women. The point is, when we thought hard about how to deal with chronic poverty among the elderly, we built a system that was supposed to take care of the most vulnerable of us. And it has joined us with the civilized world in having a way to work and retire with dignity. It's a hard way. It's a complicated thing. We have to fight for Social Security. We have to fund it right. We have to think of the benefits and trade-offs. I don't pretend to have those answers. But the point is, without this impulse to take care of the most vulnerable among us, right, people still wouldn't have Social Security in this country, right? And that is because we focused on those who had been othered so long. The last and most obvious example, let me just throw one last one out there. Affirmative action was this question about how Black men and women, but also Black women would be more highly integrated into our workforce. And I could state the obvious, that when the best people are allowed to flourish, the whole country does better. The fact that you're at Harvard getting your master's degree in teaching will mean another teacher out there with new skills, new ways to guide. And by the way, a vision that's impacted by her being a Black woman who can reach back and help Black girls flourish, but also those white girls flourish and those white boys flourish.
Yep.
They're all true. But the most obvious example is when we put affirmative action into place and when we built on programs that had that as its legacy, the people who flourished the most were white women, right? White women who were already in a position of huge, the thing that was holding white women back was that they were women. And so we put affirmative action in place and they exploded onto the workforce, much to the betterment of our whole country. That's not to say that I think we should use Black women as an instrument to the good of others. That's not at all my point. My point, though, is we have learned over and over and over when we listen to the voice of those among us who have been most vulnerable, who have been most roughly treated, who have been most ignored, and we listen to their moral demands, it is not a surprise that we make the country better for everybody. I'm going to ignore the more intimate examples. Look, if we see a mother who's struggling to give her kids health care, I mean, the grand examples are meant to touch on the intimate ones. If we see a mother who's struggling to give her kids health care, we notice that Black women are often struggling to do that, and we provide for that. How do we not think that will make our country better, right? I mean, if every woman who's struggling to give her kid health care, that will mean that Black women will give their Black children better health care. That'll mean that the white woman who's struggling to give her kid health care will find that program and give her kid better health care. And if we find that mothers find that they're not succeeding because they can't balance the huge demands at home and the demands at work, and we build better infrastructure for childcare, we've seen in country after country, in Europe most in particular, that the better health care and the better child welfare and child care you have for women, the better your economy goes, the better women can succeed, the heights of power and the glass ceilings that can finally burst, and the better it is for the whole country. So I was speaking in these grand historical abstractions, but I also want us to focus on the way these intimate little stories tell us that our future will be better if we center those whose voices have been most urgently ignored, right? Black women in particular.
You know, I was reading different things that throughout the semester in this course. There's one author, and I can't remember if it's Smith or Ritchie, who talked about all these ways, and that even you've mentioned that women have gotten more rights. Thinking about women in violence or domestic violence, there's all these laws, there's these things that positive achievements that were happening. And then she goes on to say, though, that it ended up being of white women mostly, or the popular culture women, because they didn't separate by race and gender. So there started being things that, you know, they weren't looking at the specifics. And then women of color, Black women and women of color, were just looked at as racial. And they weren't necessarily benefiting from some of these advantages. So there's one thing. And then Bell Hooks, I was reading her in her book, what was it called? The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love. There's a chapter called Understanding Patriarchy. And she talks about how she and her brother were little and she liked to play marbles. He didn't, but marbles was a boy's game. And her father would be livid about how much into it she was and he wasn't, and to the extent that she ultimately wouldn't stop after he told her to, and she ended up getting a spanking and just like couldn't play marbles anymore, because this is a boys thing. You have to learn what girls do and roll. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on why Black women, it's also interesting because you can't not see Black women. Like, it's funny that you know, we're so often invisible, like you got to see us, but is it patriarchy? Is it the dominant culture stuff? Or is it just, I don't know, just any thoughts you had about why this group is necessary, but so often erased and invisible?
Yeah, it is a really hard question. I mean, I do think you've touched upon, you know, Kimberly Crenshaw's important work on intersectionality recalls what you said. You know, the sort of question, her point, her now classic point, is that our different identities react with power in different ways, right? So it is just not the case that white men and white women have the same set of interactions in the world. It's also not the case that Black men and Black women have the same set of interactions, right? There are ways in which you and I will have experiences that are the same, and they'll be defined by the color of our skin. There'll be ways in which you have experiences that are different than mine. They'll be defined by your gender or your sex, and I'll treat it as a man in certain ways, you'll be treated as a woman in certain. And there'll be ways in which you'll have experiences that are about being a Black woman, right? That are different than white women. And so, you know, and by the way, you know, nobody denies that there's also the complexity that all our identities then jostle for attention in the kind of unique thing that is you, right? That is, you know, indefinable by just any particular character trait. But I do think the point about intersectionality is, in America, race has been such a volatile, straining, deflating, and fractious problem for so long that I think it became very easy for, when conversations turned to race, to think about the things that Black men needed, right? And especially because we lived in a society for so long where men were the bread earners, right? So as you know, probably better than I do, even in our history, there were long moments where the most august voices of the Black intelligentsia said the most important thing right now is for the Black man to have a job so he can support himself and have pride. And that will build the race up before we need to worry about women. And that was, as you point out, just about the way in which men and women were viewed. It was about patriarchy. So I do think the kind of dominance of how men needed to provide and become equal meant that to the extent we thought about race, we often thought about Black men. That's also amplified, I think, by the fact that criminal law has so brutalized the Black community, and criminal law obviously focuses on men so much more. And so that there's a sadness that too often in America, when people think about crime, they think about race. When they think about race, they think about crime. And that has all been, again, male-centered. Those aren't perfect answers, but I think those are among the reasons why the sort of toil of Black women holding together families and communities, and frankly, sometimes a nation, have been easy to take for granted. I wouldn't say ignore, just taken for granted is in a way different and maybe worse than being ignored. I don't know. I don't know if they're exactly the same thing. I'd have to think about it.
I like the taken for granted expression. Not that that's a good thing, but I like that because when I was reflecting on this, I was like, clearly I knew that we are not promoted or centered, but I didn't think much about why or like what could do. Not as much as I have been lately, that I've been, intentionally thinking about it. And so maybe it is like a sort of a taken for granted sort of thing. This has been super helpful. Thank you so much for your time.
I think I've been socialized. I think I've been trained not to notice Black women for most of my life. Growing up in a predominantly white suburb of Philadelphia, I watched a lot of leaders, including in school, a lot of teachers. I only had one teacher who was a Black woman. That was not until high school. And that teacher, it was her first year there. So looking back, I have to imagine she was under a lot of pressure to stay in her lane. And I don't think other than fiction and poetry, I don't think I ever read anything written by a Black woman until college. And this is looking back now, when I was in high school, Angela Davis was speaking at a really important convention in Philadelphia. I could have been there in person. I had no idea it was happening, just not even on my radar.
Wow.
I think a lot of things in the suburb where I grew up were based on maintaining the status quo, right? And if we really listened to the voices of Black women, we would need to change a lot of things. The more I think about it and the more I get ready, the more I realize how wonderful those changes would be.
Right.
And at the same time, I know that any kind of change can be a little bit scary. Right. And I think maybe it's that fear that makes it hard to listen. I'm glad I know you, because there's this one thinking move that you've given me that I think really helps here. Because as a white man, cisgender, heterosexual, documented, employed, homeowner, sometimes it's hard for for me to see how liberation when it comes to race, you know, how that could liberate me as well. In a lot of ways, things are looking pretty good. At the same time, by listening to Black women, I can see how important it is to change and to be part of change and to work towards liberation. You always tell me when it gets hard to see something about race, just flip it and make it about gender. And that's what works for me. I was just having this conversation with someone else a week ago, right? So, I mean, as a man, I clearly have advantages, but it's also a little bit easier for me to see how sexism and the patriarchy cause me pain too. And a lot of men I've talked with, they have stories about, being boys growing up and getting some kind of really painful message about, well, if you want to be a man, you have to give that up or cut that part of yourself off or silence this voice inside yourself. So many stories like that, and I have plenty of it. But then, thanks to people like bell hooks and you, when you listen to Black women, they can talk about that, and then they can help to make those similar connections to race as well. So I can feel how gender liberation could really be freeing for me in terms of, so many men experience, including myself, experience loneliness, and we might have activity bros, but do we really have friends? There's a lot there. And then if we listen to Black women, we can turn to race as well, and we can think about how whiteness and white supremacy, it may give us a couple things, but it really robs us of the world that we want to live in. Like, I live in a city on purpose, but right now I can't enjoy so many parts of that city because racism says some people are disposable, we don't have to care about them. Well, guess what? That kind of thinking is what allows a pandemic to spread. That kind of thinking is now why I cannot enjoy this beautiful city that I live in, right? So if I want to live in the kind of world that I really think we all deserve to be in, I need everyone to feel heard. I need everyone to be valued. I need everyone to be free. And listening to Black women's voices, that's how we're going to get there.
Thank you for lending your voice to this. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks.
So I am so honored to have with me on the show the Reverend Jennifer Gamber. Reverend,
when we decenter Black women, we fail to see and recognize, name and celebrate and honor and learn from the variety of ways of what it means to be human and the resiliency and the grit of Black women that I can learn from, that I can use as models to say, to name the strengths of others and say, is that a strength that I can find in myself as well? Mm-hmm. So if I'm going to erase those or not even recognize those experiences, I'm denying myself their witness to me and my own fullness of life, right?
Right.
In a very selfish way. I think the other, and again, this is another selfish reason, but I also have been talking to a friend who said until white people realize that anti-racism until they realize that their anti-racism work benefits them, that white people won't do it to the fullest account. And that's probably true. We are all selfish people, unfortunately.
Yes. Well, not yes to the selfish part, but yes, that's a great point. I think a lot of people, white people doing anti-racism work, see it as a benefit for Black people or people of color, but it is a whole different mindset to think of it as benefiting them also. That's a really good point.
So erasing either the experiences or the parts of the lies or flattening the lies of others to a caricature means that I'm keeping them from being fully available to a relationship that I could have with them. So that means I myself am not flourishing in my own life because I have limited the world in which I live and move and have my being. And that's a deficit life. That's a life that's not flourishing for me, and it's not flourishing for others. So why does erasure happen?
Yes.
I do think that there is a significant generational shame in the United States when it comes to having enslaved people and the continued oppression, exploitation of others. I wouldn't say that it's something that we can necessarily name, but there's a trauma. I think that it happens to the oppressor and the oppressed, and we carry that in our bodies. And I think the erasure of that is sort of like you can't face what you have done to others, so you try to obliterate them. I don't think that that's conscious at all. I think it's deeply seated in who we are.
I appreciate that. The last thing I wanted to just get your thoughts on, we've had to do several readings this semester, and one of them is called, but from the book Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique Morris. And there's a chapter 3, Jezebel in the Classroom. And it talks about these girls who are like high school age, but they end up doing sex work. Essentially, they are missing days from school. There's these guys who are much older who act like boyfriends to them, only to get them in these relationships where then they have them sort of sell themselves to other people, so that the men can ultimately make money. And this was happening, and this example was some different cities in California in this book. And so these girls are missing days from schools, and there's like these truancy sorts of things, and people aren't really checking. They're seen as promiscuous. Administrators and teachers are just seeing, they're getting in trouble for missing days, and people are totally missing that this whole sort of prostitution type thing is happening with them. And then they end up in the legal system, and all these things are happening. Pointed out that there wasn't so much mentioned about the men in the story, people looking at them as the bad guys as much as they were looking at the girls as being promiscuous and such. And that's, for me, that's just like another way to end up sort of erased. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I think in those instances, what's being erased is the understanding and the recognition, and it is the recognition because it's a true reality, that these girls are made in the image of God and beautiful and full of potential. And what's happening is instead they're being objectified. They're seen as instruments to the benefit of others. And I've seen in some of my own work that this objectifying of Black girls happening, very, very young, that their bodies are considered instruments of whoever's in power.
Right. Like they're little women, right? Not little girls, little women. Yes.
Exactly. That they are, and the two instances I've seen instances where they're quite young, maybe 7 or 8, considered to be caregivers for babies. And so they miss school because of that. And so already, and this would be by, not necessarily by men, but by women themselves. So it's internalized oppression. It's an internalization of who they are, and then you pair that up with the sexualization of Black girls, then that it further objectifies them and narrows that instrumentality, right, to a particular function, which is serving the needs of men and
right.
others. And so it's so easy to erase that beneath that looking at them as objects, they actually are subjects in their lives, seeking to speak, right? Their souls are really wanting to speak. And it really is a school district's responsibility to see them as subjects of their lives, as authors of their lives, and to see that there are forces that are objectifying them, and push beyond those and get down to the reasons why, how they're in those situations that they're in. And if you don't, and so that's not, what's happening there is, by not reaching out to the fullness of the experience that they're having, they're erasing these girls as subjects and not doing the work. What schools should be doing is empowering their authorship, right?
Yeah, I like that. Their authorship, right, of their own stories. What can be different? Like how do people start? How does this change? It's a loaded question, but do you think it's about like seeing the humanity more somehow? I don't know.
I do. I think, well, you know that I believe in God.
Yep.
I believe that God cared so deeply that God sent God's son in the person of Jesus. And we all know that God chose that the word be birthed through a young girl, and she authorship over her life. And in fact, today was the reading of the Magnificat in Luke, where she proclaims that this word that has come to be dwelling with us in the person of Jesus was going to upend all sorts of structures, right? And was going to bring justice to this world. And so, I mean, as a person of faith, I think that it begins with reminding ourselves that we are children of God, and that every person we meet is likewise a child of God. And we are called through our very central being, if we do anything in life, to bring the fullness of each other to fruition.
Reverend Gamber, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, it's a blessing to know you, Samantha. And I mean, I've learned so much from you. I benefit tremendously from our friendship and through your work. And thank you for your voice.
Yes. LaShira Lash?
Yes, LaShira. I always say LaShira. My name is LaShira, but my friends call me Lash. So,
Got it. So we're looking at what happens to Black women and death, or just the violence that happens to Black women, or just like the struggle and stuff. And so for the project, we all had to do something to explore something that we've learned through this semester. So it was a great class. Like when I saw that, when I was signing up for classes in September, I'm like, wait, what? This is at Harvard? I'm going to study Black women at Harvard. Like I could not take this again. What? It has nothing to do with my education major, except that it does, kind of. So, I took amazing. It. And so because so my podcast is called Daily Border Crossings, and I started that this summer. It's been in my brain for like a couple of years, but I worked before I came here in the independent school settings as a teacher. And I did that for like literally 11 years. Like I left this summer, I was like, I'm done. But what happens in independent schools is, I think a lot of people think, the people there are rich, they don't have no problems. But if you are a person of color as a student or a teacher, it's a lot of damaging stuff that happens, a lot of traumatizing situations, because there's all this equity and diversity, this mission statements and this, this talk. But I remember interviewing a group of girls who were in the 7th and 8th grade a few years back, and it like touched me because they all seemed fine. These were all Black girls, one Hispanic girl. They all seemed fine, but like there were tears. I mean, they were just talking a lot about what life had been like to be there every day since like 2nd grade and 3rd grade, and just this treatment that goes unnoticed. And so that's my interest, but also the teachers. There's not a lot of us, and so you're unheard, and all this. And so I started holding these. Well, first I revamped my curriculum for preschool and kindergarten, so like they started learning about race. Like by the time you left my classroom, white, whoever you are, you're gonna know about Black people, you're gonna know about white people. Like you're gonna be very comfortable talking about race at the kindergarten level. And so then I started holding these workshops to teach other teachers how to be inclusive. And when I would be there, I would have other like teachers of color that would come to me to talk to me about hardships they're having at their school. So all these adults are having, so that was a part of also why I wanted to start this podcast, right? So it's daily border crossings, and it's about othering. It's about feeling like when you show up at a space, you can't bring your whole self, like you cross a border to be there each day. So in addition, so that's one thing. So that ties into the class because you could do a paper, but I want people who know me, like I can't just do anything regular. I just don't, it's just not like I gotta be
It's
extra.
not your DNA. I love it. You
Right?
different.
Like, yeah, exactly. I'll be up all night, whatever, it's due Wednesday by 5. I'll get it together. So one of the readings that we did a lot of really good ones, but one of them that I was going to bring up to you was My Grandmother's Hands. Have you been hearing about it? It's all over the place. Resma Menakem. You haven't heard that name?
No, I haven't.
Really? I'm surprised. I thought because he's medical, but you will, after this, you'll probably Google him and know he's like all over the place right now. It's a Black man. The book is called My Grandmother's Hands, and My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. So his whole thing is on how we've passed down, white people and Black people, how this racism, the trauma is in our DNA at this point. Like it's all this things that are happening to our bodies because of history, because of all the years and histories of this. If you don't have time to read, I don't know when you'll get a chance to read his book, but if you Google his NPR thing and just listen to that interview, like that'll be a good way to get an idea of who he is. In his, what chapter is this? Assaulting the Black Heart. So he talks about how sometimes one of the most damaging things he said about like that happens to Black people, or it's the least visible. He said which goes to our point about in invisibility, are assaults on Black hearts. It's the ongoing lack of human regard for Black people. So he named some of that as like not listening or paying attention to someone, or outright ignoring them as if Black bodies were invisible, interrupting or talking over Black people, not taking them seriously, or saying stuff like, you don't really mean that, or how do you know, stuff like that. So he's naming all these things that I feel like I see, and I'd like to get your thoughts on invisibility. And I mean, I know I've seen that where people just feel like, do you not hear us? Do you not see us?
Yeah.
So what are some thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, no. Well, first off, I'm definitely going to have to check him out. I was like, I'm already following him on Twitter. I was creeping on him as you were speaking because he sounds like an amazing human. And 100%, I think that is so valid what he's speaking on. And like really the way that I think about it is just straight up like gaslighting. And I think it happens all the time as a Black student who is pushing for institutional change. Like you're saying this is my experience, right? Like I'm dealing with microaggressions in the clinical setting, and you've then erected a microaggressions task force that you'd like me to serve on, and you're not going to provide me with any form of compensation, or you're not going to provide me with any form of
my friend,
showing that you appreciate my effort. So then when it comes time for me to apply for residency, right, because that's the next step after medical school, I'm not going to have anything to show for it. And then the process continues on and on again, like as people are trying to get professorships in medicine. So it's like they want us to do the work to save ourselves because they know we're going to do it because our survival depends on it. And then once we get there, they're going to be like, well, why don't you have any research? Well, because I've been serving on these task forces, right? And I think that's where the invisibility really starts to show. And I think also it shows itself when you look at how many Black physicians are at Harvard Medical and in the system, and there just aren't a lot of us, At Dana-Farber Cancer Center, there's literally, I think, 3 Black physicians in the entire cancer center. What? And a lot of that is because folks don't feel like they are being seen, so they go elsewhere. But then the challenge of that is then as a young Black student coming up, my experience feels that much more invisible because I don't see a lot of me around, right? So when I do experience that microaggression, there isn't a person here that I can really depend and lean on. And luckily, I've been blessed to have mentors who really have my back, who both look and don't look like me. But I think that those experiences are really amplified in these spaces. And I just finished reading Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and she quotes this study that showed that Like the more you interface with the caste system as a reminder of where you are in the caste system. Like, for example, even though I'm here getting my MD, and in my mind, I can start to think that I'm moving on up and I'm going to be accepted by the upper caste, which she identifies as white folks. It's that constant reminder is going to have more detriment on my health. So she was saying that those who are middle income and interface with that realization more frequently are more likely to have worse health outcomes like hypertension, chronic diseases, et cetera, because it causes more stress, which was really,
Let me get that. Wait, the ones who interact with, or who were thinking about, say that one more time.
So in our minds, we would think, okay, a person like a Black person who is low income, right? Because they're unable to have access to different resources, health insurance, access to healthcare, et cetera, they would be more at risk of having worse health outcomes.
Okay.
But what she showed in this study is that it was actually folks who were middle income who, not because of access, but because they interfaced more with the realization that no matter how much money they make, et cetera, in their workspaces, constantly being reminded through microaggressions, they all accumulate and they have this chronic effect on our health. And therefore, those individuals are more likely to have a higher risk for those chronic diseases.
That's tough. Microaggressions are so real. I do race work. I used to just do race workshops for teachers, but now I hold race trainings for for people in general who want to become anti-racist. And one of the ways we describe it is it's like paper cuts, like nobody sees paper cuts, but they hurt, right? Like people, and you could have like a whole bunch of them through just like in any given day because of the amount of microaggressions that you face as a person of color or as a Black person specifically. One of the things that I just thought of when you were saying what you said in terms of serving on these committees, listen, right? Like that's what I did. I had to get out of the space. I'm like, I was taking days off, and on my days off, I was going to another school to hold a workshop. Now, I was glad to do that because I'm feeling like I'm helping some Black student at this school, instead of my former place, being excited about that. Like they like the accolades that they get from knowing I represented this place that was helping. But then they talk to me about missing days. And I'm like, how does this make sense? I'm missing days because I'm representing you. But this, but the microaggressions add up. But one of the things I think about us being on all these committees is that whiteness is a race. Like they forget that. They think that if it's something dealing with race, that they got to go get a Black person. It's like, can you get a white person up here too? Because whiteness is also a race. I'm going to read you one more thing that Resma Minikin said. He talks about how sometimes we also do it to ourselves with invisibility. He says, the hearts, psyches, and souls of African Americans have also been routinely attacked by another group, ourselves. Many African Americans berate themselves and each other for being Black, for being too Black, for not being Black enough, for being less than perfect, for simply existing and comparing ourselves and our bodies against, what's supposed to be out there. So, I thought about when he said that, I think that's a thing, but I also will argue that we spend so much time with these questions, so much time on these committees, so much time questioning, to your point that you just made, like questioning the validity or reality of these microaggressions or trying to prove our worth, that we sometimes lose ourselves and we make ourselves invisible. I think that's a scary aspect too, because you can get so caught up that you forget who you were. You so caught up fighting this racism stuff that you lose pieces of yourself.
Right, 100%. And as you speak on that, I think of Toni Morrison's quote that racism is the biggest distraction. It keeps you away from doing the work that you innately would be excellent and great at. Like, I think that I am a great advocate for anti-racism and social justice, but I do not believe that my people were put on this world to help people understand why we deserve to exist and thrive. I think that it's so frustrating because I feel like it's an extraction of our talents, because I think that if Black folks were able to really be the amazing scientists and educators and creators.
I was going to say, like, you have that as one of your three things, like you want to create, but yes.
Right? Like if I can just sit here and just like, you know, make music and be able to connect with I just feel like there's just so much potential that we have, but so much of it is expended through trying to justify our right to exist. And I don't think that that is what we should be doing. I don't think that that's what we should have to do. But I think naturally, if we don't do it, then, you know, no one else is going to do it for us. And I think that that's what's really on my mind as you say that.
Yeah, I think that's the unfortunate truth. Like, we don't want to always. We don't feel like we should have to, but then we feel like who else is going to? It's like a freaking tough spot to be in. I want to ask you about why you think this is, like, why are we invisible?
Woo, I feel like there's so many layers to that. But I think part of it is that Black women are facing two challenging realities. And one is like this world of patriarchy and sexism. And then on top of that, we're dealing with racism. And even within our own community, there's a lot of patriarchy and sexism that hasn't been addressed.
Colorism.
And then within the context, colorism 100%. So I think that all of these isms play out within our own communities. And then on top of that, like if we think about the images that are exported through media and television of who Black women are, right? Like growing up, I didn't play with Black Barbie dolls. I'm so happy to see that like now there's shows on Nickelodeon where there's like a Black girl who's like a doctor and like doing that. But those are images that we didn't get to see. And every time we did see Black women, it was in a negative way. We were hypersexualized. And I think that the same images that white folks consume, Black people consume them as well. Like we didn't have Band-Aids. I didn't even know that Band-Aids were supposed to match the color of your skin.
Listen, you know how many people say, I've heard so many Black people say that. I didn't know either. I did not know.
Like it's really wild. Or the idea of a nude bra. I said, what? I had no clue that these things and that.
When my mom, I remember when I was little and my mama would like say she like sent me to the store. She's like, go inside and get me some stockings. And she would say, get nude. And I remember not necessarily thinking twice. Like I just thought, oh, this is just a color. But I didn't think at the time, why do they call it this color? You know what I mean? Like, why is this called nude? You know, but like, you know, anyway, right. It's just so set up for not us.
Right. 100%. And then I think then, like, if you look at how structural racism manifests, it's like you see it in our neighborhoods, like the lack of resources and how we have potholes in streets. I'm thinking about, you know, Compton, like where I spent most of my childhood. And you start to internalize that and you think that, well, is my neighborhood a reflection of myself? And is this what I deserve? And if you go home to that every day and you see Beverly Hills looking different and the people that live in Beverly Hills look different from yourself, you start to internalize these messages that you are less than and you aren't deserving of resources and access. And I think even as a medical student, I have these reflections a lot because we learn a lot about statistics related to diabetes and hypertension and COVID-19. And Black folks are always among the highest to get these diseases.
Why are we at risk for everything?
We're at risk for, right. And the way that they present it is like, oh, well, race is a risk factor. But no, racism is the risk factor because race is a social construct that you all have created. And I think that if you don't dig deeper into that, you start thinking, well, dang, I think Black folks, we're just prone to get everything. You know, we're inherently damaged. And I think we oftentimes don't have the space or time to do this deep dive and to do the reading because we're so busy trying to fight oppression into you know, through our day-to-day, you know, be a mom and take care of families. So I think that even having this conversation, I realize it as a huge privilege that I have the space to understand these things and have the space and time to do this. But it's layers. We could go all day talking about this.
We could. I know I've heard, you know, when you say people inherently think, well, I guess it's just, I'm just predisposed to be this way. I know I've heard those sorts of things where people think that's just how it is. And I tell you, it was only, sadly, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago that I learned about redlining. And it was such a huge, like, it was such a weight lifted. Like, I felt like crying. Like, when they, it was talking about how the GI Bill only went to certain people. And if you're Black, like, you couldn't get a house. And so all these white people and Black people coming back from war, they were all poor. These white people ain't have nothing, but they got money and we didn't. And it was just like this huge thing to think about. It's like, because I remember growing up and seeing people, maybe I even thought, because we didn't have a lot. And it was like, is it something wrong? Did we not work hard enough? It had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with not them working harder at all, but them being given this huge advantage. And so you get these thousands from this GI Bill, and you're allowed to buy a house when Black people weren't. And then you age out, you have kids. Now you get to take out equity on this house, and this goes to put your kids through college. So now all this wealth keeps growing. Meanwhile, Black people had to just go live in like whatever public housing or whatever they could for all these years. And it's just like, it was so freeing for me to learn that and to realize, oh, this is how y'all got it. Like, this, y'all ain't get it for doing nothing extra. And it's just stuff like that I think a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the past, that has always been the case. Like, Black women have always been like the center, like the epicenter of so many different social movements. Like, even if we look at the civil rights movement, even if we look at the latest election and how we look at how Black women really showed up in Georgia. So, because we are among the lowest rung of folks in our country when it comes to like who has the most access to power and where we fall in the caste system, as Isabel Wilkerson says, if Black women are able to be free, then everybody else, and once we're free, that means that everyone else has to be free, because our freedom necessitates the freedom of everyone around us. And I know that's a quote from somebody somewhere who said that way better than I just did, but that's really the key. And I think that the way that that's going to happen is we can't just have policies that are like, all right, we're going to have changes that benefit everybody. But I think that we really need to have policies that are specifically for uplifting Black women. Like, what kind of research is being done to explore like why Black women are getting fibroids? What type of research is being done around maternal mortality? Like, we need to address specific issues that affect Black women, because what ends up happening when we have everybody policies, Black women get left behind. And Black women are often the driving force who are like, yeah, like we always want better policies for everybody, because we're the ones who are often suffering the worst from these challenges. But oftentimes the policies, like they don't come back and do the same for us. We put them in these positions, in these high spaces, but they don't have our back.
Yeah.
So I think in order for Black women to be liberated, we're going to need people who really have Black women's backs as much as Black women have everybody else's backs.
100%, 1000%, right? And then they all can be liberated too.
Yep. This is the
so
key,
much.
y'all.
Yeah.
Don't play. Liberate us.
Right.
And you can be liberated too.
It's only going to benefit you. It's only going to benefit you. Right. Thank you so much, Lash, for your time.
Yes, of course.
Hey, and for this portion, I'm so honored to have with me Clarabelle, Jenny, Loyola, and Silvana. You guys, please, why don't you introduce yourselves? We'll start with Clarabelle.
Hi, I'm Clarabelle. I am an Afro-Latina woman at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in the TIE program.
Hi there, I'm Jenny Portillo. I am a first-generation American, daughter of Mexican and Guatemalan immigrants. I'm also at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in the school leadership program.
Yate she Loyola Rankin Yanchia, Hudson Isla Nakai Bashichin, Twaglini Dashe Nakai Dashanele. Hello, I'm Loyola Rankin. I am Navajo from Coyote Canyon, New Mexico. I am Meadow people born for the Mexican people. My grandfather was Two Rivers Flow Together, and my paternal grandfather is Mexican. I am a first-year student at Harvard Graduate School of Education in the higher education program.
Hey y'all, I am Silvana Rueda. My full name is Silvana Maria Rueda Games. I know it's a mouthful. I am half generation American, which is another way of saying that I am an immigrant, but I came here when I was pretty young. I was about 4. So I've kind of straddled both worlds. I come from Costa Rica. I'm of both Costa Rican and Nicaraguan descent. I identify as mixed race Latinx, and I'm also a graduate student in the Technology Innovation Education program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
So I wanted to speak to you, ladies, because I wanted to speak to people of color, but who are not Black people, who may be partially Black, or may not be Black at all, but who are not white and who still have thoughts and opinions and views on Black women.
I can go first. I was thinking about this question and kind of where I'm at regionally in the US, here in the Southwest. You know, we do have a wide diversity of people, but very few Black people in our population, which is really interesting in a lot of dynamics, especially when you get into like the history of the Southwest and everything. But when I was thinking of this question about why does the erasure happen, I was thinking of my own personal experience, not only with Black people, but with Black women, was in media. And, you know, growing up in the middle of nowhere, all we had was like TV and like movies. And just seeing the violence towards Black women was very strong and perpetuated inside the industry. So anytime, like growing up when I was a kid and like I'd see a Black woman character, I'd be like, oh no, she's gonna get abused. Like something bad's gonna happen to her. And I think that that type of continuous violence that's seen on television and, you know, like in all these little minds from when you're young, it kind of gives, I guess, this sense of permission, which is very disgusting in a lot of ways. And then dehumanizes in a lot of ways too, which is really, really gross. I can't find another stronger word for that. And, you know, I would think with like the influx of Black artists who are talking about representation, I still get a little bit of that erasure happening. In different ways, of course, but with like Tyler Perry's work, with the show Blackish, especially towards Bo, the mixed race character, and just very silencing, which is pretty interesting inside of the characters. But I'm definitely more of a person who's interested in like representation in mass media and how that teaches the general population of like how we can treat others. But that's kind of where I would start, was probably with like representation when I was like in the 90s.
When you mentioned thinking about the media and you're like thinking of Bo and Blackish, do you mean with her role, you think she'd have a bigger presence? Like she is a doctor, she's head of this, I mean, she's the mom of this huge family. Do you think she'd have more of a presence? Is that?
I think it's not so much the presence, because she does have such a strong character, but she's constantly silenced by the characters around her, her in-laws, her husband, her children, and just the way that she's openly disrespected for laughs and being like, oh, it's funny because we can disrespect this woman who's a doctor. And I was just like, you don't get that way by like being a pushover inside the medical field, let alone a Black woman. So I genuinely just did not understand how these two could exist together. And I don't think it was like a representation on her as a character, but definitely how her family treated her was pretty egregious to me, again. And I was just like, oh, coming from a matrilineal society, we don't treat our women that way. And it was it's really hard for me to watch, honestly. And I kind of stopped watching after season 1.
Gotcha.
One thing that question made me think about was a study that I read for a paper that I wrote in ethnic studies, because I wrote about Black women and how I felt that there was an erasure of the history. And I ran into this article called Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. And for me, that's where it stems. It stems from, as children, Black women are just seen, Black girls are seen as less nurturing. They don't need protection. They need to be supported less. They're more independent, or they know more about adult topics or sex. And it starts, the study actually proved that it starts at the age of 5. Between 5 and 14, Black girls are just getting their childhood taken away from them and just being perceived in society as kids that don't need protection, or kids that are not allowed to make the same mistakes as other kids. And as an educator, for me, that was very eye-opening, because working in a school system with all students of color and Black girls, I saw some of these things happening to them going to the offices more, them getting in trouble for being loud or for having sass, or it's almost like the essence of who Black women are is it's hard for other people to like understand.
Thank you for that. That reminds me of something I've heard or read about Black girls being seen as little women instead of little girls. It's like there's this womanizing that happens starting early. Thanks for that. Savannah or Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, just as you were talking, Clarabelle, like I started thinking about like how, especially like during the election and whatnot, I'm sure we've all heard like, oh, Black women are the real heroes, right? Or like Black women are saving America, or Black women are so strong, and how, as much as it sounds like you're giving positive praise, it negates the amount of oppression and suffering that Black women go through even within their own communities. Because I think that that's something that in different readings that I've done, I've noticed that, like, you know, it's very clear to us that the Black community is not monolithic either, and that there is a lot of issue there around like traditional patriarchal Black culture being oppressive to Black women and denying them their humanity. And I think that gets them transferred over into other communities where we learn to see Black women as being so strong that they like don't need additional support or protection or to be elevated or uplifted because they've got this. They're strong. They can do it without us. So that's like one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and how even if we think it's like praise that we're giving, it's really an erasure and a lack of acknowledging what the circumstances are that many Black women are living with, and particularly in this country, but across the world as well. And then in thinking about like my own upbringing, I mean, colorism is a thing anywhere, right? But especially when I think about like messaging that I grew up with, having a Mexican father and a Guatemalan mother, like, you know, they didn't really interact with any Black people growing up in their countries. Like, it just wasn't a thing that they were familiar with. And so their first exposure, you know, came when they came to this country, and their understanding of who Black people are in general, especially Black women, also to Leola's point, comes from that media, right? And so if you're growing up watching, you know, I grew up watching lots of soap operas, all the telenovelas, right? Like, you never see a Black face, particularly a Black woman's face in that. And I remember there was one Black male actor who was cast in every Black male role that there was. And I don't ever remember really seeing a Black woman in any of that, right? And like growing up, not questioning that because I didn't know any different until I started to get older and realizing this is absolutely not reflective of the experience of anyone who's out in the real world. And two, like that it's deeply, a very deliberate, deeply ingrained bias that happens in media representations, particularly coming out of Latin American media. And how even Mexican or Guatemalan people who are in these shows tend to be the more European looking counterparts, right? It's not going to be someone who looks like me. It's going to be some light-skinned, blonde, blue-eyed person who clearly has some colonial ancestry that happened there. And so I think that all of that mixed together definitely also contributes to the erasure of who Black women are and what they endure, and in across different communities and groups, for sure.
Thanks, Jenny. You know, I remember thinking about this memory of right after the election when Eva Longoria, I don't know if you guys saw, where she was just like, oh, you know, Black women did great, but the real winners or whatever are Latina women. And then people were like, wait a minute, why? What are you talking about? First of all, that's not accurate in terms of like the voting numbers and like what happened percentage wise. It's like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't as a Black woman, because, you know, to your point, that like what Black women did with the election is incredible. And then people can perceive it as, well, they don't need help. They're so strong, they can do all these things. And it's just like, that's not the point. It's like, and then after that, you want to get, you still want your respect. You still want to make suggestions and demands. You want, and then people are like, well, slow down. It's like, no, I shouldn't have to slow down because this is what I should get. And then the Eva Longoria thing makes it, people sometimes I think forget that like the real, like that white supremacy is the real enemy, and not like people of color disagreeing and arguing and such. But so just to your point about that, like, I wonder how much of that too, thinking about the media and who is seen and not seen in other countries and what people think about the roles of Black women and stuff. So you think about all those things. Thank you so much. Silvana?
I'm snapping for so many reasons. So when I think of kind of the erasure, the invisibilizing of Black women in particular, I think of this like intersection of colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism. Like I think of so many different intersections that just converge at this point that's so dehumanizing and dangerous. I say that because I really believe that this erasure is a global phenomenon. It happens in so many different communities across the world. Anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism is a global phenomenon. Speaking for kind of my, speaking from like my geographical vantage point and from like my heritage and ancestry, there is so much, like Jenny was saying earlier, there's so much anti-Black racism in Central America. There's so much anti-Black racism in Costa Rica and Nicaragua, in my ancestral homelands. There is that erasure stems from such an early age. That erasure happens when you learn about the history of, when I think about, for example, like my cousins, my family members, myself learning about the history of Costa Rica when we were younger, like Black people were erased from history starting very, very early on, which is, really like, I don't know if I can swear. Can I swear? Is that okay? You can say no, because I swear a lot. Anyways,
I suspect that adults, I don't expect that kids will be watching this, but do what you gotta
do. Okay. Oh my God, thank you. Anyways, what I was gonna say is that it's so fucked up, right? Like it's some fuck shit. I see this line between erasure and like this like pendulum swinging between erasure, erasing, invisibilizing, and exoticizing and fetishizing. Like I also see a lot of fetishizing, again, across communities, across cultures of Black women, Black culture, but especially Black women in particular. I feel like the answer to that erasure is not what so many white women and non-Black women of color turn to, which is like, oh my God, let's fetishize. Let's, try to imitate or try to like put on a pedestal in a way that is so unbelievably also plays into that same kind of just a different angle and a different just a different side of racism and just a different side of white supremacy. So I feel like it's a big question. I don't necessarily there's so many different angles and so many different ways to answer it, but that's
it is interesting that that Black women can be seen and not seen at the same time. It's like this fetish thing. It's like which is so many different angles that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking of fetishizing. I'm thinking all the way back to slavery, where Black women or Black people in general weren't really people. This 3/5 thing, but if we want to have sex with you, so what are you having sex with then? If it's not a person, it's like, what is this? And then that needed to be kept quiet, I guess. But like, it is a complicated one, and I don't even know like the fetishizing. Elaborate just a little bit on what you mean.
Yeah. So when I say fetishizing, I mean like what I think of is like, for example, like white women who are just so obsessed with Black women that they participate in blackfishing, or that they are so, are like, they themselves feel like they start co-opting parts of parts of Black culture, but specifically parts of Black female culture. They start.
Did you say black fishing?
Black fishing, yeah.
I don't know that term.
Yeah. Oh, and anyone else can jump in here because I can explain it kind of from my vantage point, but I'd love to hear what others, how others define it and what others think. So I understand the term blackfishing to mean like a non-Black person, including a white person, non-Black person of color, essentially co-opting aspects of Black culture to the point where they make them to the point where it's like the Rachel Dolezal effect, for example. Like that's an example of blackfishing, right? Or somebody wearing braids who's not, and in a way that is very clearly co-opting braids and very clearly kind of it's like cultural theft, basically. So again, it's this line. So that's how I understand blackfishing. I see so much of that with like woke, progressive, white, well-meaning white people who are just so, again, they participate in this exoticization. They participate in this in this total fetishizing of Black culture and of Black women.
Got it. Gotcha.
I would throw in there just like the entire Kardashian family. I don't know if you need to edit that part out because of like lawsuits or anything, but if you look at those girls, I'm like, you're white. Like, I don't understand this like cake on makeup to make yourself like more dark skinned. And then also the body modifications that tends to happen through that family's like history and co-opting that Blackness, as it were.
Gotcha.
Again, not a monolith.
Right. There's times when it's time to be monolithic because they put us in a group like voting and stuff like that. But then there's times where we're not. Like, I got you though. Yeah, Clarabelle, sorry.
No, that's fine. I was just gonna add on to that when Silvana was talking. It made me think about recently my own experience with Ivy Park. I happen to be a real huge Beyonce fan, and I went on her Instagram, and there was these two women that were not her Instagram, Ivy Park's Instagram. And there were just two women that were just full out blackfishing. Like they're from Russia, but they had like big hair. They were like makeup to make them look ultra brown. But when you go look at these women's profiles, their whole entire feed is just all of this appropriation and blackfishing. And that's the problem right there. Like Black women are not monolith. We're not like, in some ways it's very disrespectful because it makes it seem like most of us are just one type of identity and we're not, but it really frustrated me because I was so upset that whoever was marketing her social media, Ivy Park's brand, like you should have known better, but clearly they didn't.
Thanks for that. I also it's like, again, it's erasing us by replacing us. Is that what they're trying to like? We're trying to replace. You know what I mean? It's like you're gonna do all that, but you're not necessarily, other than Beyonce, you're not going to promote Black women. Then like if you're gonna do that, we shouldn't. But then like, where are all the other Black women that you have all over your website? Then like show the range of us, or like that we are somebody that you aspire to be like or something. But it's like just taking the pieces and not giving attribution or got it. So it's like the ultimate cultural appropriation, it sounds like.
Well, yeah. And
I think,
oh, sorry, Loyola, go ahead.
I just wanted to throw in there too, it's not just like physical aspects too, but also like language and culture. I'm thinking particularly the gay culture and how it co-opts a lot of the language, the slang, and how fast things become like cultural icons and then all of a sudden they're co-opted into like whiteness. Having to explain where self-care comes from and like what that actually means. That also ties into that blackfishing too, I think. But yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, just building on what all of you have said, like also thinking about that, like the things that are being chosen to appropriate are the things that Black women are so often persecuted for. Like, especially when I think about hair and how much like it's not just that you're putting on braids. It's not just that you're taking something that is not culturally yours and not acknowledging what it came from, but you're also putting on something that a Black woman is not getting a job for, something that Black students are not being allowed to graduate for, right? And so it's like this erasure and this negation of the very existence of things that make Black women and Black people's lives harder. And I think that that's the part that infuriates me when it comes to I didn't even know it was called blackfishing, but the minute I was going to type in Silvana, when you were explaining that, like, you mean like Rachel Dolezal? Because that's who I was thinking of when you were saying it. But then it also brings up, you know, people, like, I looked up the term just now, and there are all these other people that are also getting accused of that as well. Like, you know, when Ariana Grande like presents herself as like looking a lot darker than she actually is, where you have to question, like, is she ethnically ambiguous? And it's like, no, she's not. She's just making herself look that way. Or when it comes to language or even intonation, right? Like, we're thinking about Iggy Azalea and how if I heard her on the radio, that I would not assume that she's this white woman from Australia, and how messed up that is, right? Like, it just speaks to the point that it is like a worldwide phenomenon, that there's this desire to co-opt the things that Black women do and acknowledge how great they are, but not when they come from Black women. And like, when Black women do the things that everyone wants to elevate, it suddenly becomes a reason to persecute and to deny them access to things that they are absolutely entitled to, like any human being is. And I think that that's what I struggle with all of this. It's not just that, oops, like it was a misstep or a faux pas. It's like, no, it speaks to a very real void that exists when it comes to acknowledging the humanity of Black women and all of the things that make their lives so much more difficult.
I appreciate all of the thoughts. You guys are great. You're bringing some great perspectives. I really appreciate that. What you just said, Jenny, made me think about butts for sure, because Black people were too fat, right? We were just like too big and too curvy. And then people who aren't, you know, white people essentially, just, you know, or the Brazilian butt lifter, you know, this thing that, you know, the injections. And I'm like, I thought butts were bad. And then making it seem like it's, I mean, that's certainly a Kardashian thing when people wanted sort of a Kardashian body. And there was just this period where it's like, there was this emphasis on other people for curves. And it's like, you know, Black women had curves for a long time. So thank you so much.
There's a prominent Navajo singer, Redmilda Cody, who is half Navajo, half Black. And she has a documentary out called Becoming Redmilda, where she talks about her experience growing up half Black, half Navajo on the Navajo Nation, and just the amount of racism that she encountered from the Navajo people, and like how that shaped her story. And what that experience has been like for her. And it's a really powerful documentary to me, because, you know, having grown up on the Navajo Nation and like unfortunately participated in some of the racial segregations that happened, and, you know, you're a child, you don't know until like you're like, oh shit, that was actually really fucked up. And, you know, just being more aware of her story as a Black woman, as a Navajo woman, and that she doesn't have to give up one to be the other, and that she can exist and be happy and be successful and be all these things that she wants to be. And also go buy her album. Follow her on Instagram. She's doing a lot of really amazing things for our nation and our communities. But how that leads to the liberation of all of us, right? I mean, just watching someone be who they are and love what they love and create what they can create, I think that is just like the best thing. Not the only thing, don't get me wrong, but for sure, really great artist.
When I think of the process of centering Black women, I think of like starting from a place of critical reflection, starting from a place of like first kind of looking inwards and saying, hey, what are the relationships that I have with Black women? What roles do I like expect Black women to play in my life? What are in the workplace, for example, we can start there. like in schools, in education, in academia, whatever the work, you're kind of the workplace that you're coming from, what roles, what are the Black women that who are the Black women that I interact with? What roles are they playing? If there is, for example, if there are a couple of Black women in the nonprofit that I work at, and they are consistently being asked to book the conference rooms or to do the administrative work, which is a true story. Like, I have seen that many times. What is that about? What do I do in those moments? How do I participate in that, benefit from that, push back against that, challenge that? I think that is an incredibly important place to start, that place of kind of internal self-reflection, because it illuminates it can illuminate the path forward. If I don't engage in a process of critical self-reflection, I sometimes then, and I think that this is true, I'm using I statements, but I think that this is just like a universal truth across the board, that there are sometimes that we then participate in the same systems that we're trying to dismantle and perpetuate the same systems that we're trying to dismantle without that process of inward reflection first. So I feel like that for me is a really important, that's an important starting point when it comes to centering Black women.
Thank you. I wrote down participate, benefit, push back. I think that's critical to, for people to ask themselves, how am I participating? How am I benefiting? How can I push back? Thank you for that. Clarabelle?
In the power of pushing back, Loyola actually reminded me of an event that I went to at Harvard, and I watched this documentary called Jamaica y Tamarindo. And it was about Afro traditions in Mexico. And I think what's really important about centering Black women is having these stories told, because Black women are not monoliths. And these experiences being on the forefront, these documentaries, the people making them, those stories are super, super important in terms of pushing back and centering the narrative to more tell our stories. And I like, when I think about centering, I also think a lot about healing. When like you talk about self-care and where that comes from, I think that Black women have a whole essential, a more deeper need for when we talk about healing. And I think people need to not use healing for capitalism purposes. If we're gonna do healing in our communities, and if we really want to center Black women, everyone needs to heal, but we also need to understand that certain sets of groups of people have a specific way that they need to be healing.
Thank you for that, Clarabelle. I'm appreciative of you guys, because I feel like I was thinking about centering Black women, or the liberation being like, they helped lead something like the Montgomery bus boycott, and then they revamped the bus system. Like when it was over, it was almost bankrupt. And then not only did that save the business, the boycott in the end saved the business, but it also made the buses possible for everybody. I was thinking, but I hadn't thought about these other pieces. So thank you for adding these other ways to center in how they can be helpful. Appreciate that. Jenny?
I'm thinking a lot about just the practice of interrogating things that are put in front of us and taken for granted sort of statements. I think about it particularly when it comes to things like what ends up online, right? And thinking about how I had to have conversations with people about, this idea of Black women being heroes and being so strong and whatever, and having this conversation. And frankly, it's something I've had to confront for myself, because, the great thing about the internet is it never lets you forget. And so I saw a Facebook post of mine from 4 years ago that said, Black women are the real heroes here. And at the time I thought that what I was saying was, was an affirming statement. And now I realize well, why is the onus on them to have to save this, save this country from itself to some degree? And what am I really saying when I speak to the power and the strength of Black women, right? And so I think that there's this interrogation that has to happen, both of the things that we say, but also of the things that people around us say about Black women and to Black women. Because if we don't start like kind of with that critical interrogation, you can't really get the conversation started, right? Because everyone needs to be on the same page around what do we mean when we're saying these things and what do we not mean when we say these things, and not just what do we think we mean, but how is it impacting others, and like interrogating that intent versus impact of when people say things like this. So I think that's like one thing. And then the second thing I'm thinking about is that, is this push for not just having these nice conversations about interrogation, but what within your specific field, your specific locus of control, can you do to help elevate the voices of Black women, and making sure that they're not being lumped together as a monolith, and thinking about what, like listening, yes, but also speaking up and making sure that you are giving that place to Black women as they want it, not assuming, oh, I need to like speak for you, but also I don't want to let you do all the talking either. Like actually listen to Black women in your life and listen to what is it that they want and they're looking for. Because I think that if we make the assumption that, we either have to step completely aside or completely step in front of a Black woman, we're going to continue making the same mistakes. And it comes down to each individual person is different. Each community has a different struggle. And so the first thing that we as non-Black people of color can do is start by interrogating and listening, and then moving forward from there with intention.
Thank you so much. I was thinking about what you said, the first part about your post from 4 years ago, and the Black women are heroes. I think it could be both and, though, not entirely either or. I think both and. I think there probably are lots of Black women and men, or people who would like to see Black women are heroes still, but it could be nice if there's like a sentence after that, like an addition that doesn't mean they still don't need support or something like that.
Exactly. So acknowledging the humanity there, not just like this kind of abstract uplifting that we're doing.
Right. Listen to Black women. I was at a conference one day. It's like a day-long conference, and the speaker, I cannot remember her name. She does a lot of like diversity like stuff in different schools, but her closing sign was this sign that somebody had from like a crowd or like a process, I don't know, but it said "Listen to Black women," and she put that up for like most of her speech. And so I appreciate that, because then people will know what the needs are and it's also like there's this group of people who've had, how Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality, like oppression for being a woman, oppression for being Black, and all these setbacks and all these things. It's a kind of the best kind of person to learn from, in my opinion, like somebody who's had to go through a lot. Like those are the sorts of people who end up being like, really good teachers. So especially like I'm thinking about Black women in this country. And yes, yep. Mm-hmm.
I mean, not only on top of like listening to Black women, but for sure, like relearning how we listen to Black women, because we are conditioned to not. And even though we're like, I'm an ally and, I'm a friend and like, I have Black friends, all the other like dismissive things we make in our lives of like, no, I am listening. I'm like, but are you hearing anything? Like, what are you actually doing? And the other part of that too, I think, is also like reconditioning like your body's responses. Because one thing I've learned in like the movie example I gave is like seeing a Black woman, like I immediately like, oh my gosh, she's going to get hurt. Something bad's going to happen to her. And, having that body's reaction to be like, okay, no, you can watch like Black Panther and like the Black women aren't going to get hurt. They can fight. They got themselves. But even just like reconditioning our bodies and like how that on like, what's the word? Not instinctual, a programmed level, I guess, of living in America, right? And other countries too that are anti-Black. Because I hear a lot of people being like, well, I am listening. And I'm like, but are you hearing anything? Read the room. Like, this is obviously not working for them. So you need to stop and just get on their side. Even if you don't completely understand, be like, nope, I'm just going to back you and I'll learn along the way.
That's fantastic. Back you and learn along the way. Thank you, Loyola. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Clarabelle. Thank you, Silvana. Thank you so much for adding. You guys just added so much to my project, and I really appreciate it. So thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Man, I'll begin concluding by sharing my reflections. The findings and revelations were quite interesting. There were a host of reasons offered for why Black women are erased, the erasure itself a process in direct contradiction to results that mean the greater good for society. We heard time and again that it's highly beneficial, of greater good for the masses, when Black women are not only not erased, but are, in fact, centered. To call the benefits meaningful is an understatement. Plus, they're far-reaching, going way beyond impacting the group of Black women itself. Jonathan mentioned being trained from early on not to notice Black women. Such training is commonplace. No Black women in the physical form until high school, while concurrently not even in the literary form. From the personal to the broad, Reverend Gamber pointed out ways she and others could personally benefit from relationships with Black women, while Echo Yonka noted Black women's fight for affirmative action caused many white women and others to reap lasting results big time. A theme coming out of the Women of Color group was that Black women's traits, characteristics, and such are desirable as long as they don't come from Black women. Life doesn't work like that. Besides, the whole of us together is worth much more than the sum of our parts. Perhaps people are missing the greatness that is Black women because of what Lash noted about Black women having so much potential in the form of philosophers, scientists, architects, artists, lyricists, inventors, designers, creative creators, thought leaders, problem solvers. That was my parenthetical. Potential that gets expended, as Lash said, out here justifying our right to exist. I think of my own hurtful experience in this area, mostly in workplace settings, the erasure in the form of coworkers ignoring, dismissing, minimizing, or times when I decided to talk to an administrator about the unacceptable treatment and erasure toward me or a different Black woman, only to have said administrator side with her fellow white woman, claiming an inability to think of any ways to address it. This would leave me going from shock to confusion to code switching so much to fit the dominant norm that I'd be complicit in erasing myself, effectively a prop in the play Collins mentioned, until choosing to use my voice. Let's go back to Collins. She writes, "One day, an amazing thing happened on stage. The props began to move. The uppity ones had the nerve to occupy center stage, pushing the star out of the limelight. Some props that had been waiting in the wings to make cameo appearances stormed the stage and refused to leave. The stage became increasingly crowded by an array of props, many of which saw one another for the first time. You might imagine the star's response to this topsy-turvy disruption of tradition. He was dumbfounded. It was almost as if the chair that you're sitting on now yelled, 'Get your behind off of me,' and ran out of the room. Wouldn't you be shocked if an object that you completely took for granted, a prop that made your life comfortable, turned out to be a living, breathing being with free will that did not bend to your own?" She asks us readers to please note that the story of the day the props began to move describes the politics of doing intellectual work, not simply the ideas themselves. She said she wrote Black feminist thought not simply as an academic project or something done because it was chic to do. Instead, it's her experiences as an African American woman. Being treated as a prop is not simply a convenient metaphor. For me, she writes, as is the case for many other African American women, myself included, and all the others treated as props, this treatment has tangible, palpable effects. She lists some, but for me, there's physical and emotional toils. So she brings it present day. There is no scripted ending to this story because it is our story in the making. Individually and collectively, we are all involved in writing the next chapter in this drama, each from a different vantage point. Individual Black women resisted their place as objectified props and aimed to tell their own stories. I encourage each of you to write, edit, and rewrite your own stories until they ring true for you. You know, treating Black women as if they are disposable has been a detriment to society, leaving it stagnantly spinning its wheels, often aimlessly, until it's ready to center Black women again. This is cretinous, fatuous, inane, stupid. Until society is ready to realize this, or unless maybe it never will, listeners, you can start by centering Black women. This reminds me of a story Stacey Abrams shared of having such high grades she and other high school students from Georgia were invited to the governor's mansion. Only the guard on the grounds let other families enter, but told hers the event was not for them. He doubled down, wouldn't even check the list for her name until Stacey's dad was unrelenting in his request. Stacey Abrams said she has no memories of meeting the governor that day, but has vivid memories of that incident. It was an erasure attempt. She didn't let it keep her down. We know how this story ends, right? She ultimately ran for that office, ending up just shy of occupying that house. And even when she didn't, she registered nearly 1 million new voters to impact positions like that of governor, and, likely, who guards the grounds. She decided she wouldn't be erased. Again, listeners, center Black women. If you're a Black woman listening, we can start intentionally centering each other or loving and centering ourselves. Hashtag #ustoo.
You look at me like I'm unfamiliar, acting brand new like you never knew that you like them thick. I've been carrying this weight in the world beneath these braids, and I'm confused. Would you take the pain that came with all the parts you wanna claim for you? You want my thighs, you want my stride, but not this melanin. You want my hair, but you don't care for this complexion. I'm a Black woman. Sitting on a cold floor in the corner after school, recovering from your cover-up when you told me I wasn't right for you. It wasn't hard to believe, 'cause when I watched TV I would never see a